Welcome everybody, especially the people that joined just on time. We're going to get started in a few minutes here, give people some time to join. In the meantime, I think Larissa just posted in the chat, but if you want to post where you're joining from and then what you're most excited for either this summer if you're in the Northern Hemisphere or this winter if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, would love to hear from you. Go ahead and post in the chat. We'll get started in a couple minutes. All right, awesome. I see we're well represented here. Looks like we've already got almost 6 different continents, I think, from all over the place. Thank you all for joining at all these odd hours. Very excited to be here with you all today. Brazil, Los Angeles, Cincinnati, UAE, Canada. Okay, nice. We'll give everybody like 1 more minute here before we hop in. Right, Barcelona, Tel Aviv, Buenos Aires, and yes, Elena. People everywhere here. Very exciting. Awesome. Hello, Jamaica, Tulsa. All right. Cool. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started and just start at least with some of our introductions here to get us going. Welcome to this webinar, How to Establish a Product Analytics Practice. My name is Ryan. I'll be your host today, and I'll go over some introductions for myself in a second. But first things first, since everyone all is joining right now, I think this is a great slide for us to go ahead and get started on. Questions. You're probably going to have questions throughout this webinar. As you have them, please feel free to use the Q&A function in Goldcast. That's one of the tabs that you'll actually see on your screen. And under that Q&A section, it will post all the questions, and you can actually upvote other people's questions. So we've seeded a few questions in there just to get things started, but feel free to upvote those or add your own as we go. And at the end, when we actually go through the questions, we'll answer them in order of upvotes. In terms of the recording, I think there's already a question here. You will get that within the next 24 hours. You can share it, review it, refer back to it. If you're having technical difficulties, you probably cannot hear me, but you should be able to see the screen. And you can be able to check your audio settings by clicking the caret next to the settings icon. And if you continue to have problems, please post in the chat and we can try to help out. And then last but not least, we have some helpful resources under the docs section as well. If you want to see the blog, for example, that inspired this webinar, and we'll add some additional things as we go on. So those are the need to knows. We're about 5 minutes in, so I think we can go ahead and get started. So first things first, I think it'd be great to just do a quick round of introductions on Mixpanel and who's here speaking with you today. And so at Mixpanel, our product vision is to transform how teams build winning products by providing the most powerful product analytics that everyone can use, trust, and afford. And ultimately, today, what we're going to be talking about, right, is how we can help you, right, realize the vision of using product analytics to build those winning products. And so from my side, as a quick introduction, I'm Ryan. I'm on the Mixpanel customer success team. And what we do is we're really product analytics experts here to help you figure out how to make product analytics work at your organization. We're typically focused on adoption, on onboarding. We also focus, though, on customers who have maybe been with Mixpanel for a while and they're not getting the full value out of the tool, and they want to understand how they can get back to a place of value. We've been around for over 10 years. We've helped over 1,000 customers and over 100,000 end users. And so we like to draw on all of those experiences in being able to help you achieve your goals. Me, Ryan, I'm head of the customer success team. I spent the past decade, whether it was in consulting or at Mixpanel, helping customers implement, adopt, and onboard with new analytics software. I've held almost every go-to-market role at Mixpanel. So I've been on support, professional services, customer success, sales. And me personally, I'm a builder at heart. So I love to build new teams, processes, tools, etc. I'm technical by nature. So I love to tinker and figure out how something works and why it works a certain way. And I'm always curious to learn from you all what's working, how you use product analytics, et cetera, so that we can share that same knowledge right back with the community. And ultimately, that's what we were here to do today, right, is actually share those best practices with you all. So with that, what will we cover today? We'll start with why a product analytics practice. And we'll talk through what does a product analytics practice mean and why are we here today. We'll then go through our kind of 4-step process for actually getting started. So starting with the simple use case, talking why data governance matters, democratizing product analyses, and then building a culture of experimentation. Once we've done that, we'll talk a little bit about how you can scale your practice beyond just getting it to work at the beginning. And then lastly, we'll cover those Q&A questions. So please, again, post those in the Q&A tab as we go along and upvote the ones that you want to see answered most at the end. So we'll get started. First things first, why a product analytics practice? Why are we here today? What does it mean, right? And I think when we think about what a product analytics practice, means, right? It's important first to think about what are the actual problems and challenges that people have in adopting product analytics. And ultimately, when customers come to us with product analytics challenges, these problems are very similar. And so first things first is access, right? Do the end users, your product managers, your designers, your engineers, do they actually have access to the data that they need to make an insight? If they do have access, right, that might not be enough because oftentimes the way to actually get that insight requires some sort of advanced querying knowledge, whether that's SQL or knowledge of a BI tool or some other analytics platform. And so you might have access, but do you actually have the knowledge and the know-how to actually get to the point of making that insight? The third is time, right? Is it easy and quick to make that insight, or is it something that's going to take a long time and a lot of effort to get to? And ultimately, are there actually people whose job it is dedicated, right, to have that time reserved to making those insights? And oftentimes, right, this is where you might have a situation where either the end user or the team responsible for those insights, right, just doesn't have enough time to actually go and give those to the rest of the organization. And then lastly, if you have users who have access, they know how to make the insight and they have the time to do it, right, can you actually connect that with an outcome? Can you see how that insight actually makes an impact on your business? And ultimately, right, these are kind of the core areas where customers want to get better and faster to make their company better with product analytics. And if we take kind of a look on the left and the right at what today might look like for many of you potentially on this webinar, and then what the ideal state looks like around a product analytics practice, today might have a lot of issues here with these core challenges. And so on an access level, right, people might not have the data they need to answer questions, or it might be controlled by a centralized team. It might not even exist. In terms of knowledge, you might need SQL to actually take insights from a mess of data. Even if you have a BI tool, right, SQL is still needed for all those follow-up questions. And so you might know your high-level metric, how many users are there. But if you want to break that down by country, by device, by locale, et cetera, you need to be able to write SQL to do that. On the time axis, right, you often have this case where there's a whole team of analysts potentially tasked with running queries and providing insights to the rest of the organization. But because there are so many requests and everyone wants access to data and wants to make their own insights, they're typically overwhelmed and they're not able to actually get those insights quickly. And then lastly, depending on your organization, the tie to impact may be non-existent. And we often see, right, companies are launching new features, they're running experiments, they're changing their app design, but they don't even have the data and the insights to know if those changes worked. And so that's what today might look like. Some of those cases may resonate with you, some of them may not. But the case to be better, right, and what we want to talk about today with the product analytics practice is, in terms of access, every end user has the data that they want. And if that data doesn't exist, you actually have a process and a way to get that data into the hands of end users. On the knowledge side, end users can actually do their own analyses and pull data self-serve, and they can find their own insights from the data. They're not required to learn some new querying language or coding language or new tool to do so. On time, the idea is that users will save time self-serving answers. So instead of this back and forth between you and the analyst and figuring out how do I get this insight, right? You can just go to it yourself. And then lastly, right, your end users can make that logical connection between the insight that I have about the product and the actual impact that the thing had, all in real time as they're looking at the data. And so this is kind of a great way for you to maybe see where I am today and where I want to go. And in terms of how we get there, right? How do we get to the right? It's really important to think about how you're going to go and roll out product analytics. And I think one of the key mistakes many people make is you're buying this tool, you're doing this implementation, you're like, great, we're going to run this 3-month project, everything's going to be great, and we're not going to have any problems, right? The reality is, like, product analytics isn't like that. Actually adopting product analytics and embracing product analytics as a practice, it's a transformation of your team's workflows, your processes, and your culture, right? To be data informed. It's not just a 2-month thing and you're done, right? This is an ongoing evolution, and it's something that your actual team, right, is going to have to commit to doing on a day-to-day basis. And so that can seem daunting, right? The word culture for a lot of people is like, whoa, that's going to be hard to change. And so we want to try to simplify how you can do this to the 4 key steps below. And so first things first, start with a simple use case. Find out what works, get something working, and iterate into scale later on. Next, figure out how to implement data governance early on. Some of the decisions you make around how you send data, you name data, you connect data between systems can have a big impact on how you're able to leverage product analytics. And so we'll talk through some of those design decisions and how they can have an impact on your long-term scalability. Third, democratize product analyses. So it's not enough just to start and get the data, right? You got to get people excited and show them, right, why the use of something like Mixpanel and having self-serve analytics is so much better than the current alternative that they have. And then lastly, once we have people excited, they're pulling insights, right? How do you actually leverage that data within your team and within your culture to really get people excited about connecting those insights to outcomes? And so today we'll focus in on following these key steps within one individual team within your organization. And after we're done doing that, we'll actually talk about how you can scale that beyond just one team within your product engineering or design work. Great. So with that, I will step into the first one, which is start with a simple use case. And too often when we work with customers, one of the challenges that we see is that customers get started with product analytics, they're excited, they see the potential, and they try to track everything everywhere all at once. And ultimately, it kind of does look like this GIF when they actually go and run the project and do the implementation, because trying to do so many things all at the same time across all your platforms, across all your devices, it's tough. And so there is a better way. And this approach really falls down because at the end of the day, it's going to waste time, energy, and money. And so what happens with this approach? Well, we do this big project, we do a ton of planning, we have all these process docs, and we have Gantt charts and a project plan. But we spend so much time, right, sequencing this project plan, we don't actually find out what works. And the reality is every customer is different and how you use product analytics is different. And so learning, what works for your team and your specific company is really important versus doing all of this planning. You might waste developer resources on implementing unnecessary data. Oftentimes, customers are saying we need 1, 2, 3, 4 months worth of developer time to go and implement Mixpanel. The reality is if you have one developer actually spend a few days, right, actually seeing what works and what doesn't, you can get a lot more value out of that. The 80-20 rule around data is that 20% of your data is going to be really valuable and lots of people are going to query it and you'll make tons of insights. But the other 80%, the harsh reality is it's probably not going to be used, if at all. And we see this a lot with our customers, right? You can see that certain data is just leveraged really well by the organization. The other 80% isn't. And so you're going to waste a lot of time and effort on that 80%. Focus on that 20%. And then last but not least, if you're running one of these implementations and you're trying to get started with product analytics, people get excited like, "Ooh, I'm going to be able to pull my queries. This is exciting. I can't wait." And if this process takes a really long time and you're not able to show those end users value, right, they're going to get frustrated and they're going to have loss of interest. And so, again, I think it's helpful to kind of layer these two next to each other and really think about what does it mean to track everything all at once versus what does it mean to track a single use case. And when we think about tracking everything everywhere all at once, right, we're talking about every team in your org. So let's say I'm a product org of 200 people and we have 10 teams. I'm now thinking about 200 people and 10 teams, very big in terms of scale. There's priorities that are different across those teams. So everyone's competing for their priorities to be number one. You now have this really long lead time in terms of developer time. You have to coordinate across all the different teams and their launch cycles. And worst of all, right? If you mess up, you're going to waste a ton of time with nothing to show for it. That's it. You'll have messed up your data and you'll have done a bunch of work that's useless. And you won't know what works till the end. If we compare that, right, to tracking a single use case, this is where you can get started with one team. They have clear goals. There's a clear leader and priorities. You can spend a little bit of developer time to really figure out what works, try something, experiment, and iterate with it. And you can, from there, right, just figure out what's best and scale from there. And you might look at this and you might be like, well, obviously I'm going with option B, right? That's what my company would go and do. And when you put it this way, right, yeah, it's kind of clear to see that option B is a better way. But the reality is many customers actually end up in option A. And the reason is, right, you have these organizational pressures. You're afraid you're going to not track something important. You don't want to make one team angry by making them wait longer than another. You think this is a quick project, you'll get it over with, it doesn't matter, and nothing has to happen after that, right? All of those things, yes, they're important. They are considerations. But the reality is if you try to do everything all at once, you're going to have a bad time. And the best customers actually follow what's here in option B on the right, because these are the organizational best practices of the best companies that we all aspire to be, right? They're experimenting, they're iterating, they're growing, they're scaling. And this type of approach follows your engineering standards. You can quickly figure out what works and what doesn't. And you have a path to value. You can show people how it works and learn from it as you decide to go and actually scale your practice. And so if we think about translating this track a single use case into what some common companies might actually use, right? Here are some kind of examples of how you might think about a simple use case. And so if you have a company like Uber, which hopefully you're all familiar with, they're in ride sharing. Their pilot team, right, that first team to get started might be rideshare operations. And so at a simple use case level, they'd really be interested in that user journey from searching for a destination, booking a ride, and completing that ride. If you want to get extremely simple, and I would challenge you to maybe think about it this way, because ultimately you could send one data point to Mixpanel and get so much value out of it because of how quickly people can slice and dice that data point in a self-serve manner. The extremely simple use case for Uber, right, would just be completing a ride. And so that's kind of an example of where we could get started simple or even extremely simple, right, and start to see value. If we take some of the other examples here, Viber, who's in social and messaging, maybe our pilot team is the messaging product team. Their use case is sign up, send message, receive message. Extremely simple, sending a message. For Yelp, who's in restaurants and reviews, the simple use case is sign up, view restaurant, leave review. The extremely simple use case would be leaving a review. And so these are just some examples to get your creative juices flowing. But ultimately, right, if we're thinking about this, what is the bare bones user journey to track our actual use case for our pilot team? And we could get extremely simple if we really want to start small and learn as we go. You might be thinking, okay, great. I've got an idea of maybe where I get started. How should I generate additional use cases, right? And go about prioritizing those. And ultimately, we'll start up here in the upper right where it says ask a question, because the way that you want to think about implementing use cases and adding new data and making analyses should ultimately be tied, right, to what do your actual end data consumers want to know about your users. Otherwise, you're going to spend time implementing data and tracking data that's not really valuable or used by your audience. And so it all starts with what are those questions? What do you want to know? Next, we go and implement the data. So do you have that today? Great, we can skip this step. But if not, right, we need to actually collect that data and figure out how to get it into Mixpanel or some other self-serve analytics platform to make an insight. Once we have the data, users can build a report. They can test their hypotheses, dive into the data and actually figure out, right, is this thing driving what I think it's driving? Once you're there, you can actually take that insight, share it with your team, right? Send it out in Slack or whatever other tool that you use. And you can repeat the same thing over and over again for more and more use cases. And the reality is, as the number of questions gets smaller and smaller and you implement more and more use cases, right, you're going to get faster, you're going to get better, and you're going to go know more about it over time. And so that's kind of the idea of starting with a simple use case and how you can start to iterate into scale there. You might now be asking, okay, but like, what if the data doesn't exist, right? What do I do? And that's kind of our next topic, which is this idea of implementing data governance and standards early on. And I want to start by saying there's really an inherent trade-off in collecting data, at least today, in terms of speed and scale. And so you might see these cars starting very orderly and they're at the right speed. And then you see all these other ones just like flying in with this speed and crashing into the screen here. And this is kind of the idea that, you know, you think something can be really fast, but the reality is the things that are fast often don't scale well from a data perspective. And so when you're getting started with product analytics, you really have to consider this trade-off between speed versus scale to figure out how you want to get started. And so what I mean when I talk about speed versus scale. So on the speed side of things, right, we're thinking about the easiest way to collect data is the way that wins. So whatever's fastest, just get it in. The quality doesn't matter at the beginning, right? It's just existence. Like I don't have access to data about my user's journey. I need it, right? You'll follow the path of least resistance, what's simplest for our organization, and you kind of take a short-term view on what matters. On the scale side, right, the companies who actually have achieved scale with data, it's always the trusted way to collect data. What is the best way to collect something that end users will trust? That's what wins in terms of data collection. And the quality of that data is valued over distance. So oftentimes there's more process and overhead to get data into a tool like Mixpanel, but the quality of that data ultimately is much higher than if you just prioritize speed. On the scale side, this typically involves looking at your entire architecture and taking a more long-term view on what matters. So the decisions that you make, even if they are in benefit of speed, will help you iterate into scale later on. And in this particular trade-off, right, in the short term, many customers are going to prioritize speed. You want to get value quickly. You want to make sure that you actually get up and running and you can see that value to end users. But I think the best customers take a little bit more time up front and they actually define what's my data stack, what are my data sources, what are my data standards, so that their short-term plan for speed is aligned with their long-term plan about how they actually plan to use data at their organization. And in terms of what that looks like, right, and in terms of how you actually go and implement data to something like Mixpanel, we could do another webinar and series on just this slide alone. But at a high level overview, there's lots of different ways to collect and send data to Mixpanel. In terms of the speed and the scale, things that are on the client side, like the Mixpanel client side SDK or a Mixpanel proxy SDK, these things all collect data directly from the client and then send data to Mixpanel. Developer can drop in an SDK, they write a few lines of code, and we start collecting data. That's really easy to get started. The problem is it doesn't scale super well. You're going to have developers on every platform, on every client, write this tracking code. And as your app is released, old code is still out there in the wild as people don't update their apps. And so scaling can be really hard. The next iteration above client and proxy SDK, right? If we talk about like a server, you can actually start sending, your server logs or your data from your backend code to Mixpanel. And yeah, it'll take a little bit more time to get the right events and the right properties, but scale will be much better, right? You'll have the ability to quickly iterate on some of the different tracking code that you have and send it into Mixpanel. If we move on to some of the actual more third-party data collection tools that are out there in the data ecosystem, the next would be Customer Data Platform or CDP. These are great. Just track all your data on the client side once, collect it at a CDP level, and use the actual CDP, right, to determine where you want to send that data downstream. And so, speed to get started, it's actually still pretty easy like the client side. You have to do a little bit more configuration, but you can scale an entire team or company, right, on a CDP. Next is reverse ETL. If you don't actually, for instance, have a data pipeline or a way to collect behavioral data today, you can actually model your data in SQL that exists. Maybe these are like your records of your transactions, your signups, your logins, et cetera. And you can turn those into events and send them to Mixpanel. And then lastly, streaming. If you're a company that actually lives on data, right, and your app or your product doesn't work without collecting data and processing it in real time, right, you could actually send data directly from that streaming pipeline to something like Mixpanel. And so ultimately, it's kind of the decisions of how you go about deciding on which of these methods to figure out how you're going to go break that speed or scale trade-off. Just to get another quick note on data stack and data standards. So oftentimes people skip this step and they just start that tracking data to Mixpanel and they don't really think about how it's going to connect to their broader data ecosystem. So on the data stack side of things, what's your company's source of truth? How do we get that into Mixpanel? On the transformations, do things need to be standardized or enriched in some way? What environment, right, does the data stack live in? What access level do people have, et cetera? And most customers will have a simple data architecture diagram, which we'll go into an example of on the next slide, showing how data routes and where it goes and what the different sources are. And this will really help you understand the gaps and where you need to focus your efforts. On the standard side of things, this is a lot more about internally, right? How you document best practices in your workflow around data. And so does it have consistent naming conventions? Can we identify a user the same across different platforms? Who's going to own data governance? Are there any security concerns around PII, where we store data, et cetera? And these are things that will evolve for sure as your company grows. And, the standards you set when you're 20 people will definitely not work when you're 200 and won't work when you're 2,000. But thinking about these basic elements at the beginning will help you set a good foundation and save a lot of headache later on. If we think about what a data stack looks like, right? If you're thinking about speed and you're at the beginning, let's say you literally just launched an iOS app yesterday to the App Store, right? You're probably going to look something like on the left here, where you have data coming from the app about a user authenticating, making a purchase, et cetera. You're going to be using Mixpanel to collect data about your users. Did they open the app? Did they click this button? Did they make a purchase? And then you're going to have that probably sending to some sort of data warehouse ultimately. But at the end, right, you might have broader ambitions around scale. You're not just going to be tracking what's coming from, the app itself, but you might have a customer data platform and you'd be collecting data across, iOS, Android, et cetera. You might have transactional systems. For a B2B company like Mixpanel, that might be Salesforce. For a B2C company, right, like Meta or Instagram, right, this would actually be transaction records, for example, of people making purchases. And so all of that would be connected with the data warehouse as your source of truth. And this would be piping out to a number of different destinations, like something for Mixpanel for product analytics. And so these are very simplistic examples of a data stack. If you have questions or you want inspiration, I would highly encourage you to go and Google this. There are people that have very complex stacks and diagrams out there, and there's examples you can work off of to really start to chart what your end stack should look like 12, 18, 24 months from now, so that you make the right design decisions in terms of this speed versus scale trade-off ultimately. So we've talked about getting started, setting our standards for data as we're collecting it. Now, how do we actually get people to use that data? And when we think about democratizing product analyses and getting end users to self-serve their answers, this is often the hardest part. Your end users are going to be so used to whatever they've been doing for so long that getting them to go and use Mixpanel to pull their own analysis means you need to break those habits. And if you're a smaller company just getting started, the habit might be, I'm writing a SQL query to get an answer. Well, stop writing the SQL queries and start forcing yourself to use Mixpanel. If you're a much larger company where you have a team of analysts supporting the rest of your organization, you need to break the end user habit of let me email an analyst and wait for an answer to instead helping show those users, right, how doing self-serve and pulling their own insight will be much more valuable and quick for them. And so this can often be a challenge. And so when we think about self-serve analysis, we do want to keep thinking about this concept of adopting it team by team. And we'll talk a little bit about what we mean by units of scale, but the team is the perfect unit of scale for you to focus on driving your first adoption efforts. The next is this should be led by champions. You're going to need people who are change agents within your organization. This could be in title, this could just be in responsibility, but you need people who are actually going to help others, right, see the power of self-serve and get them to adopt something like Mixpanel. And lastly, these two, collaboration and fun, right? It's all well and good if, you know, we're adopting within our team and we have these cool champions, but people are going to have questions. They're going to want to celebrate what they find. They're going to want to share it with the rest of the team. And so finding ways to set the norms around collaborating and having fun with self-serve analysis are crucial elements to getting people to adopt the tool and get really excited about what they're doing with something like Mixpanel. So when we think about scale in terms of units and where you should start by focusing your efforts, we like to define at Mixpanel these kind of three fundamental units of user, team, and organization. And if we're thinking about a user, that's just one person. That could be me or you that's on this call, right? And getting a user to change their habits isn't too hard, right? You can convince them one-to-one. You can get just that person to switch what they do. But the problem is it's hard to scale one individual user. And ultimately, they're going to have limited influence, right? They're only going to know so many people. From a team perspective, you can actually convince them tops down, right, from their leadership quite easily because there's one person. They'll have shared context and goals. And so they'll all be talking the same language about how do we achieve our goals? What are we going to do to get there? And because you're talking that same language and you're thinking the same way, it's easier for everyone to change their habits and get better together. And lastly, the best teams are often the ones who influence organizations. If we think about the organization, it'd be really hard to go convince everyone at a 2,000 person product org to go use Mixpanel tomorrow, right? They're all going to have competing priorities and goals and things that they already have on their roadmap. And so it'd be really slow as well to try and change them all. And the other key nugget here, right, is that the organization is so influenced by the best teams that it's often lagging behind what the best teams are doing. And so when we think about focusing on democratizing data and how you go about this whole process, right, of establishing a product analytics practice, you want to start by winning over one team. And after you win over one team, right, and you get them to the point that they're actually self-serving insights and seeing the power of product analytics, you can take what you've learned and the best practices and the insights and scale that right to the rest of your organization. You probably saw this like champions on the last screen. You might be asking yourself, like, what is this? And if you're new to product analytics, this might be a different concept to you, but if you've seen product analytics be done successfully before, you've probably seen these champions. And so when we think about a champion in terms of like their responsibilities, that's what's on the left, right? It's like they're going to help grow the usage. They're going to help drive change. This might be part of their career progression. They're going to be the ones who are like helping others use the reports. And so internally, they're great for your organization because they can connect the usage of Mixpanel to organization and team goals. They can actually help surface the right reports and data to other people. And ultimately, they can help unblock other users to make their own insights. They're also great, though, as an external product analytics feedback loop. Probably some of you on this call are the people that you would consider yourselves to be a product analytics champion within your organization, right? And you're here trying to get better. You're trying to figure out how to use Mixpanel better, remove blockers, give product feedback, learn, and make Mixpanel better for everybody else. And having these folks, whether they're formally identified through their title or if they're informally identified through responsibility, is pretty critical to make sure that your product analytics practice actually has the support and the backbone within your organization to get the questions answered of your teams. And you might be thinking collaboration, having fun, what he said earlier, like, yeah, that seems kind of wishy-washy, right? But the reality is, in order for you to change the culture of your team, you really need to think about how you integrate product analytics into your team's rituals. And this could be your stand-up, your product review, your retrospectives, your planning, your launch announcements. Each of your teams is going to work differently, and the rituals and the culture that you have is going to be different. But if you can think about how you integrate product analytics into those rituals, it will go a long way towards collaborating and having fun. And for many of our customers, right, they actually, for example, use Slack to have a stand-up every week. And they'll actually use the alerts from Mixpanel to post in Slack, how are our metrics trending? What's going up? What's going down? Do we need to actually have a conversation about this? And those are types of things that you can start to integrate into the way that you work to really get your team collaborating and having fun around product analytics. And if you start to integrate these things into your rituals, right, and winning over your team, this is where the actual culture of your team starts to change. And you're going to move away from feature focus and start to be really focused on how to connect the insights that you're making to impact. And so we call this the culture of experimentation. And this slide's kind of fun, right? Depending on where you are in your journey, you might be like this. You might even still be waiting for a question from your analyst or another team, right? And so what used to be that time waiting can now actually be spent so much more productively, right? As end users can go test hypotheses and experiment at speeds that they didn't even think were possible before. And to really kind of illustrate this point, right? If we talk about the before and after, and we keep thinking about, right, before product analytics practice and after, right? This is the actual user workflow of a company who used to have some other process for generating insight and what it looks like when you have a product analytics practice. And so before, right, we're talking days and weeks. Someone submits a question and they're waiting for an answer. They get an answer, but they have a follow-up question. They're waiting 3 more days. They get an answer, but there's another question. And this whole process, right, just repeats itself back and forth of like, I need an insight, but I don't know where to go. I don't have access. I don't know how to query the database. Please help. And so you can see how many days and this can take. If you think about after, right, you have a question. What are you going to do? Well, you're going to go to Mixpanel. You're going to build a report. This is going to take minutes, right? You're going to answer the question, but most questions in analytics have follow-up questions to really dive deeper into the hypotheses that you have and find the true insight. And so the beauty of self-serve is that you get rid of this feedback loop between the people who don't have access and knowledge and time to get an insight, and you put it in their hands so that they can start to connect that with the actual impact to the business. And so, with this culture of self-serve, data-informed decision-making, you're going to be moving in a matter of minutes and hours versus a matter of days, weeks, months. And to be frank, I've actually heard years before, which is crazy. But the idea is not only going to save time, but you're going to get better faster, and you're going to be able to use that time, right, to actually fuel innovation within your team. For a case study, just to kind of contextualize what this means, right? Yelp is actually a Mixpanel customer, and they actually reduced their data analysis cycle time from weeks to days, and of course are all trying to optimize even further to move from days to hours, right? And so the idea here now is you can actually see between when you ideate and you have an idea and you have a hypothesis and you launch a feature, right? You can quickly see the impact, measure if it actually worked, and then use those insights to fuel your future roadmap planning and future investments in terms of where you're going to go as a product team. And so leveraging a self-serve tool like Mixpanel for this understanding can really help your team not just save time, but put the power in the hands of the end users to actually go and drive your business forward. So we've talked a lot about how do we win over a team? What does this process look like? The last step to this, right, is like, how do you scale this beyond just one team that's actually using Mixpanel? And here at Mixpanel's customer success team, we like to think about this from two axes. So one is quantitative, the other is qualitative. And on the quantitative side of things, we typically think of this as adoption. And so we recommend weekly active users. This could be monthly. It really depends on the organization. But at the beginning, you should really sit down and think about, like, how many users should I have after 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks? And that can actually set your goals in terms of how you want to progress in terms of getting users to go and use Mixpanel. It also will allow you to think very critically about what are the best teams to go first and where to start to drive that change with the rest of the organization. And then in terms of why active users, ultimately active users is just a great proxy metric to know that your team is getting value out of the tool. And so if people are active, they're using the tool, odds are, right, they're actually self-serving insights and answers to their own questions, and they're getting value out of something like Mixpanel. On the qualitative side, it's just as important to actually celebrate the milestones. And we think of this typically as the outcomes for that team, but like, what are the actual goals you have with self-serve? Not just, I'm going to save time, things are going to be faster, et cetera. But like, if we implement Mixpanel on our simple use case of our core funnel, we're hoping to better understand how we can improve conversion by 3%, decrease drop-off, whatever that goal happens to be, right? And you can go start to prioritize those. And once you've implemented Mixpanel to see that data and put it in the hands of your end users, celebrate it, put it in your rituals, put it in your all hands, and really get excited about what's happening there. If we think of this whole team by team rollout approach and kind of summarizing this together, right? After you've learned what works and you have some of the foundation in terms of your product analytics practice, it becomes very iterative to go to each additional team and get them to adopt. And so the idea is we'll start with their questions. We'll make sure they understand how to track the right data, help them build some reporting, keep asking more and more questions. We'll celebrate what we've actually shipped, and we can keep moving on to the next team and repeating this process. And so in this way, we can really scale from, what is a team and one individual unit to the entire organization. And I do think one of the key things that's often missed when we scale from the team to the organization is that you do need some organizational directive to democratize data. And the reason I say this is because if your team is using Mixpanel and you're getting tons of value, right? But for instance, your boss's boss, right, believes in BI and an analyst team serving queries for the rest of the organization, your goals are going to be in conflict. And so there is a level of organizational directive needed to really get buy-in to scale beyond specific teams. And if you're, the leader of a product org, whether that's VP of product, CPO, or maybe you're head of data, VP of data, chief data officer, et cetera, right? if you're thinking about establishing a product analytics practice, it's not enough to put in standards. You also have to live and breathe this. And so product analytics needs to become a core part of how you review your organization's metrics, how you run performance reviews, how you run team and all hands meetings, and how you budget, right, for your organization as well. If you're actually self-serving insights, your budgeting process will change. And so, tops down, it's really important to have some level of this support. I do think, depending on the org you work in, you might be wondering, how do I do this if I don't have this today? And I think there's some tips and tricks we can go into in the Q&A, but from the beginning, right, having this support is key if you want to move past teams to organizations. And so with that, I hope you enjoyed the content of this today. We're actually going to move into the Q&A from the chat and see what was upvoted and go ahead and answer those questions first. So I'm going to sort by most upvotes. And awesome. So I think the first question that I'm reading here, and sorry, I'm looking at my other screen where the questions are instead of sharing here. What do you do if your team doesn't trust the analysis they are making in Mixpanel? This makes it hard to scale. This is actually probably the most common pitfall with product analytics. And in terms of that trade-off between speed and scale that we talked about a little bit earlier, I think one of the key things that you can do in terms of making this work for your organization, and I'm going to go back to the slide just so it's up as we talk about this, is instead of making design decisions that are all focused on speed, if you only focus on speed, right, you're going to end up with these cases where people don't trust the analysis that they're making. And so picking an implementation method that allows for a hybrid approach. So maybe you're using speed for tracking some of your clickstream data. The user landed on the homepage, they clicked this link, they viewed this item. That's what we would call clickstream data. And a client-side SDK can be great for that. But where people ultimately start to lose trust in data is how it correlates to key goals. And so if you're an e-commerce company and your goal is to drive purchases, you need to get trustworthy data around purchases into Mixpanel. And the best way to go and do that is to actually take one of these other methods like a CDP, reverse ETL, or event streaming, and or the server-side SDK, and use those to actually track data to Mixpanel. And the reason is you could actually take the exact transactional records that you have in another system, and based on experience, right, you're probably comparing what you see in Mixpanel to some BI tool and the purchases that you see there. If you're going to be doing that and you need to be very accurate, the best way to do that is actually to evolve your data collection method to something that actually allows you to scale and is more accurate over time. I think the other thing around trusting analysis at the end of the day is that keep in mind where the user, right, where is the user coming from? What's that habit that they've built up over time? What are they comparing to? And so keeping that in mind will help you actually go ahead and isolate and diagnose, right? What are the core pieces of data that users are using in Mixpanel and that they distrust? And how do we go put a plan into place to actually fix that data over time? And again, the habit is really hard to break. And so if you want to win over an end user and you want their trust, you need to collect that trusted data and help them show them that the data is actually correct between those two systems. The next question I think I see here is, can you elaborate on how other customers have built product analytics into their key rituals? How does this work? Yeah, so this is a really fun question. I think I gave a few examples on the slide itself, and I'm going to go back to it just so we have it up as we're going along. But at the end of the day, every product team is very different. But we typically see they have some of these key rituals around stand-ups, reviews, retrospectives, planning, launch announcements, etc. And so if you're thinking about how you actually integrate product analytics, right, into those key rituals, what we mean by that is actually making them a required part of each of these activities. And so if you're thinking about doing a product review, for example, and you're trying to say, was this feature launch successful? Well, if you're actually going to go and do that, right, you need to embed product analytics graphs, insights, etc., into that product review. And so, as an example, a lot of our customers use Notion. Notion actually has a plugin now where you can pull in a Mixpanel dashboard into an actual Notion page. And so when they plan a new product, or if they're doing a retrospective, our customers actually take Mixpanel and embed it in Notion, right? And put that data next to all of the other things around, was that successful or not? Where are we investing time, et cetera? Another thing around planning, right? A lot of times people will go and build a product roadmap. What are we going to go build for the next quarter, right? You can actually take the Mixpanel data that you have and make it part of your planning process. And so again, if it's a Notion, go and embed it. If you're using, Google Slides, right, and having a team, if you're using Google Slides and building a roadmap there, right, putting the graphs around the why you're building certain features goes a long way, right, towards actually getting your team to understand, hey, it's important not just, to have access to the data, but it's really important to actually use that data to make an impact and actually determine what I'm going to go and do next. On this in particular, I will make a shameless plug. I do think this is a great question for the Mixpanel community as well. And so if you're not in there already, we do have a Slack community with a lot of other Mixpanel users, somewhere you can go and ask this question to get some more like actual, hey, in your product team, that's in this specific org, what did you do to embed this in your key rituals? But this is something that we've learned and seen over time. And oftentimes, right, when we have customers ourselves come and speak to us and speak at some of our events, right, they're talking a lot about how they looked at their own rituals and their own processes and embedded product analytics into those, right? Not the other way around. And I see some things in the chat, so I'm just make sure. All right, cool. The next question that we have here, what tips do you have for ensuring that self-serve analyses are done correctly with the right insights coming out at the end? We found that sometimes non-data people may not build the right report in Mixpanel. Awesome, Maria, that's a great question. So I think one of the key things that you can do is actually using the product to help you. And so in Mixpanel itself, all of your reports and your boards that you build will actually show up to new users in the Discover section, so that it will actually show a brand new user who's coming in for the first time. What are the most popular reports? What are the most popular boards that exist? And so typically what we recommend here in terms of the product, right, is you can actually build a board in Mixpanel that introduces people to your project. And so especially for different personas or people that are new, right? You could have an actual board in Mixpanel that says, welcome to Mixpanel. You can build this, and you can actually put in some of the key reports and analyses that your team would find interesting right away. And so that's one way that you can actually go ahead and make it easier for a new user to self-serve and find the right insight. I didn't include this slide in this webinar, but I think one of the other things we often see companies do, right, is they also document their best practices. And so it's not enough just to, for example, have an insight and put it in a board, right? But how does your team actually collaborate and communicate? Is that in Slack? Is it in Notion? Is it in Confluence? Where is that, right? Is it in Teams? And so going and documenting the best practices for certain types of analyses and putting it front and center for people can go a long way. And so using the product to help aid you there, and then also documenting internally with what your culture and norms and best practices are around documentation, how you use Mixpanel can go a long way there specifically. I'm just checking the chat. Okay. All right. Next we have here, what should I do when my boss wants to track everything and I want to start small? How do you solve these disagreements amongst the team? I think there's always going to be organizational pressure from the top, right? To do things quickly, to get the most value, to get all the data, etc. But I think the reality of the situation is, right, if you lay out to somebody in your organization, the pros and cons of these different approaches, I would say most people are going to say option B is the right thing to do. The key here, right, is understanding that, option A looks attractive because it's this one-time project and we're going to get everything done. But option B, right, if they're not picking option B, you probably have a bit of a bigger disagreement here that is more cultural in nature. And what I mean by that is, if you're actually choosing, option A, you're probably thinking that this as a project and you're just going to track everything and it's going to be perfect and there's nothing to do after that, right? I think it's important for you and your boss to actually align that, like, adopting product analytics and making a product analytics practice is an ongoing investment, and it's something that's going to actually change the culture of your team, right? And if you're not agreed there, I think that's step one. Make sure you're on the same page around what adopting product analytics as a practice truly means. And then secondly, right, it's a lot of laying out these actual facts of how quickly can we get to value and learn something and do something, right? If we actually just go with the single use case versus tracking all the things at once and potentially wasting a lot of time. The next question that I see, and I know we have about 4 minutes, so I don't think we'll get to all of them, but we will follow up on the ones that were not answered separately in the community. So for Roland, what's the best strategy for quickly deploying data collection tags for common components and user events that reuse the same trigger across multiple pages / screens? I would say this is a bit more technical in nature and probably not worth going into specifically on this call. But generally speaking, right, with those implementation methods that we outlined, there's a lot of different choices around how you can go and scale your practice. And so there's ways within, how you actually track data using helper functions, for example, on the client to track data the same on different screens and pages. But also, I would encourage you to explore something like a CDP, as they're really good at actually helping you track similar data across similar platforms so that you can use it across your stack. But we can take that conversation into the community as well. I think there's a lot of nuances around what platforms you're on, how you track data, et cetera, to give a very specific answer to that. All right, Eliza, how do you suggest the team presents data to stakeholders to help direct product updates / shifts? Should it be a steady stream of insights consistently, or is it better to compile a single report with key takeaways at longer intervals? I think this does depend on how your team works, but I think the short answer is both. And the reason I say that is because, a tool like Mixpanel can actually help you do both. And so, using something like boards, right? That's a great way for you to go and actually build an actual report of what are your key metrics and what's the story. And so building out not just, hey, here's the insight, but what's trending, what's the story, et cetera. You can have a board that actually presents those findings. And then, you're actually saying, okay, should it be a steady stream, right, of insights? This is where you can actually use alerts and the functionality around actually observing changes in a metric and posting that, right, as an email or into your Slack channel or whatever medium you ultimately want to consume that in. You can actually use these alerts to keep the stream steady. And then depending on who you're working with, right, you can actually change the unit of scale that you're catering to. And so in your team Slack channel, for example, you might have an alert that goes off every week that tells you how your core metrics are trending. And you might have a board that you're using to show all of your team KPIs and the story that's happening behind those. Those are all things that could be accessible by the rest of your organization. But then you could have, for instance, for your whole product org, a Slack channel where you're doing the company KPIs, and you can connect your work right to those KPIs as things go along. And so I don't think the answer is one or the other, but you can actually do both. All right, there are a number of additional questions here. Unfortunately, we're about to run out of time. So for all the rest of the questions, we will follow up with the posters there and make sure you get your answers, whether that's in the community or otherwise. But beyond that, I just wanted to say thank you very much for attending this webinar today. Excited to hear all the questions and learn from you all. If you want to continue the conversation, like I said earlier, please feel free to join the Mixed Panel Slack community. I'm in there if you want to ask me questions directly. And of course, you could actually get help from the rest of the product experts on this call. So thank you again for joining. Really appreciate you all being here, and have a great rest of your day.